This is an author's reading of One Dude's Guide to Being Bipolar. So I'm here in Amish country, Holmes County, and I decided to read this chapter here because it's about kind of what to do when you're either manic or depressed and what self-care looks like. And for my birthday this year, my fiance planned this whole trip that included bird watching. She got me a book by David Sedaris, one of my favorite authors. She got me like this chair to relax in, and then she took me on this surprise trip that included bird watching and staying in this awesome treehouse cabin. And so I'm just, really lucky, and I think that this is a good place to read the chapter on, what to do when you get in trouble. So here we go. Chapter 10. What condition my condition is in. How to tell when you're manic or depressed and live a complete life. It often comes as a surprise to people, but I frequently don't know what mood I'm in. And it's not just me. I would say that every bipolar person I know often finds it difficult to say for sure if they're experiencing whatever mood they think they're experiencing. This is especially true for mania, but it's even true of depression. That's partly because the changes in your mood or behavior can be so imperceptible and the symptoms so benign or seemingly normal that it becomes difficult to know whether or not you did something because you were using regular thought processes or because you need to up your meds. This becomes especially difficult in relationships when your significant other knows what mood you're in and you don't. It can be very taxing trying to convince someone they're manic and not in the best headspace to make a $10,000 purchase on a new camper that they can't afford, especially when you share finances. So how do you make it easier on them and yourself to recognize the symptoms of mania? For starters, make that contract I talked about earlier and explicitly give your significant other permission to tell you when they think you're going manic or depressive and forego purchases until you're more stable. But you bear some responsibility as well, especially if you're single. So how do you recognize the signs on your own? It's a bit of an art and a science to be sure, but it starts with being familiar with the telltale signs of mania and depression and then having an understanding of how those symptoms manifest themselves in you when you're in one or both of those moods. And the stakes are kind of high because the sooner you recognize the symptoms, the easier it'll be to deal with them. Many a hospitalization has happened because the bipolar person didn't recognize or refuse to believe what their symptoms were telling them. Don't be like those bipolars. Be a smart bipolar. Be an achiever. Recognize the signs and act accordingly. But what are the signs, you ask? Well, according to the Mayo Clinic, being in a state of hypomania or mania necessitates having at least 3 of the following symptoms simultaneously. Abnormally upbeat, jumpy, or wired, increased activity, energy, or agitation, exaggerated sense of well-being and self-confidence, euphoria, decreased need for sleep, unusual talkativeness, racing thoughts, distractibility, poor decision-making, for example, going on buying sprees, taking sexual risks, or making foolish investments. They go on to add some additional signs, explaining that signs and symptoms of bipolar 1 and bipolar 2 disorders may include other features such as anxious distress, melancholy, psychosis, or others. The timing of symptoms may include diagnostic labels such as mixed or rapid cycling. All of these symptoms are ones you can self-monitor if you're willing to be a little introspective and brutally honest with yourself. Are you excited about everything or have a million different business ideas per day? You're probably a bit upbeat and have increased energy. Have trouble just focusing on one thing or continuing to jump from one idea to the next and seeing connections everywhere? Sounds like racing thoughts. Are friends telling you that you seem talkative or chatty? You're probably super wired. Not going to bed until 4 a.m. and then waking up at 7:30 a.m.? That's not enough sleep, dude. Did you just invest $4,000 in an online training course to learn how to start a podcast? You're not making sound financial decisions, and you should have come to me. I'm much cheaper. If you're bipolar 1, you have to be especially careful because there's almost no limit to the amount of ramping up one can do while manic. If left unchecked, you'll have yourself convinced that the Chinese government and the FBI are both after you and that your special lady friend needs to take you to a safe house because the radio is broadcasting your every move and the people who are out to get you are closing in fast. Not that I speak from personal experience here or anything, but the real danger of bipolar 1 is when you become delusional and start to hallucinate. At that stage, there's a very low probability that you're going to snap out of it yourself, And more likely than not, you're going to have to go to the hospital. So learn to recognize the signs much sooner so as to avoid that. One thing I do that some people might find strange when I think I'm becoming delusional is I say what I think is happening out loud around other people. It's a crude but effective way to check my reality against actual reality. I'll explain what I mean. Say, for example, that I think I've uncovered an international crime ring operating out of my workplace. Maybe I think one of my coworkers has just returned from a mission and is debriefing me. I'll actually say that out loud and gauge their reaction. If they look at me like I've just become a chia pet and have microgreens growing out of my head, then I'll take that to mean perhaps I'm misjudging the situation a bit. If, on the other hand, they confirm my thinking, I know I'm not too far gone. It might seem like a stupid thing, but honestly it's far more stupid to think those things and not let anyone know what's really going on inside your head. That's where you get into trouble, especially if you're a great masker like I am. That's how I got into lots of trouble that time I masked so well that my ex came to work to get me and take me home because she knew I was too far gone, but my coworkers thought that she was the crazy one and actually banned her from my workplace. I checked myself into the hospital later that day. If they actually knew what was going on inside my head as I attempted to work through the mania, however, they would have never let me step foot inside the building. Another tactic I use frequently is empirical data. Sometimes you simply don't think you have an issue because you don't see the obvious. Recognizing the obvious, however, can be a huge asset when you're struggling with a manic episode in particular. Look at your credit card statements. Are there huge jumps in spending? Where is all of the money going? If there's been a large expense like having to replace your furnace or something like that, okay. But if nothing out of the ordinary has happened and your spending went up by $3,000 in 1 month, you've got a problem, dude. Similarly, you are able to operate seemingly forever on just a couple hours of sleep while you're manic. So start tracking your sleep if you don't do that already. Doctors will tell you that sleep is the number one most important thing to do when you're manic, and they're right, unfortunately. If you find yourself regularly getting only 2 to 3 hours of shut-eye per night, just know that the crash is coming and you desperately need to rest. It's not a matter of if you'll crash at that point, just a matter of when. You can do all this informally, of course, and I would venture to guess that the vast majority of bipolar people do just that. There are, however, many people out there who find great success in utilizing mood trackers. These can range anywhere from multi-part questionnaires you take every day to monitor all sorts of indicators, to simply keeping a journal and writing down how you thought each day. If you want to get really fancy, I've even tried creating a Google form and filling it out every day, which has the added benefit of being free and very customizable, not to mention making it easier to identify trends. However you decide to do it, and there's a sample form in the appendix you can use or adapt as you see fit, the important thing is being able to track changes over time so you can see what, if any, patterns emerge. Maybe you tend to go manic every spring, which is not uncommon. Perhaps there's a predictable cycle you go through of mania and depression, or maybe there are certain triggers that happen in your life that tend to push you one way or another. These things become much easier to track when you're keeping track of them, oddly enough. And whether you stick with it forever or just try it for a set amount of time, it will be helpful. I won't lie and say I still do it, but when I did, it definitely helped me pick up some patterns that were unique to me and my own bipolar experience, and I'm guessing it will do the same for you. But what about depression? How does one know when that's coming on? Well, the good news is that it's typically a bit more obvious. That's not really because the symptoms are easier to identify, but rather because you're more inclined to believe them. When you're manic, and especially if you're not delusional or hallucinating, you want the mood to last forever. Mania feels great for a while. You're so productive and feel like you can do anything. Depression is the opposite. You can't wait for it to end. You might even, as many do, hasten to bring it to an end permanently through suicide. It's a dark place and you won't want to stay there. But how do you know for sure that you're experiencing depression and not just in a bad mood? Again, the Mayo Clinic gives us symptoms, and they explain that you should be experiencing 5 or more of the following ones. Depressed mood, such as feeling sad, empty, hopeless, or tearful. In children and teens, depressed mood can appear as irritability, marked loss of interest or feeling no pleasure in all or almost all activities, significant weight loss when not dieting, weight gain or decrease or increase in appetite. In children, failure to gain weight as expected can be a sign of depression. Either insomnia or sleeping too much, either restlessness or slowed behavior, fatigue or loss of energy, feelings of worthlessness or excessive or inappropriate guilt, decreased ability to think or concentrate, or indecisiveness, thinking about, planning, or attempting suicide. Depression can be tricky sometimes because you can also get good at masking it. I've been in depressive episodes where all I wanted to do was go out every night and drink with friends. Maybe I was laughing and cracking jokes right along with everyone else, but inside I was just terrified of being alone. Other times I've spent weeks sitting on the couch watching Ink Master episodes back to back to back, showering only occasionally, and barely eating. I almost always get a ton of anxiety with my depression as well, and find it difficult to imagine it ever being over. In fact, the one thing about being at both ends of the mood spectrum is I almost always find it impossible to remember or even imagine what it's like to be at the opposite end. That is to say, when I'm manic, I can't imagine being depressed, and vice versa. And yet a shift always happens. Nothing lasts forever, and that's the silver lining. That said, I was depressed for over a year one time because I was on the wrong meds. Cough, cough, Abilify, cough, cough. So if it's lasting that long, then you need to urge your doctor to switch up your medications, and if they won't, to get a new doctor. That's not a normal length of time to stay in one mood. But it's tricky for sure, because your depressive episodes may last a few days, weeks, or even months if you let it. And I say let it because there are absolutely things you can do to help reduce the negative effects of depression and start to reverse it. The problem is you never want to do them. But physical activity absolutely helps. I try to get myself to go to jiu-jitsu whenever I'm feeling depressed. I also try to cut out alcohol. This is a good idea whenever your mood isn't stable, but it's particularly important when you're depressed. Nothing makes a 12 gauge seem like a reasonable way to cope with your emotions quicker than alcohol. Unfortunately, you'll think it's helping you deal with your emotions, but the reality is that alcohol is a depressant, and that's the last thing you need when you're already depressed. Try weed instead, or just learn to love non-alcoholic beers and club cigarettes if you think you need to be sober. Whenever times get tough emotionally, I turn to pottery, or bird watching, or riding my motorcycle, or bowling, or listening to whale sounds. Just find something that works for you, dude. Just a little of my pottery there. Hopefully it'll burn the book. However you decide to do it, I strongly suggest trying to monitor your mood as best you can at all times, especially if you've never done it before. Of course, listening to your friends and loved ones is also important. My fiance can tell I'm manic long before I typically can, because she isn't experiencing the mood changes herself, and thus she can be more impartial. She also has a vested interest in ensuring I don't become manic. But if you find yourself frequently getting into arguments with your special lady or man or non-binary friend over whether or not you're manic, you're probably manic. But of course, what does one do once they've admitted they have a problem? That looks different for everyone, but for me, it's cutting out alcohol and adjusting my medications. In particular, I start taking an antipsychotic when I'm manic. I also start smoking more weed strains that help slow my brain down and make the racing thoughts take a break. Or if I'm depressed, I find strains that help me deal with my anxiety and depression. I also force myself to take breaks when I'm manic and not hyper-focus on one thing all day, every day. When I'm depressed, sometimes self-care is as simple as waking up while it's still morning and forcing myself to take a shower at least every other day. Whatever it is that you end up doing, at least do something. Doing nothing about your symptoms and ignoring them is the fastest way to ruin your relationships, decimate your finances, lose your job, or end up at the hospital, or even in the ground, or with your ashes in a Folgers can if you could only afford a modestly priced receptacle. Don't just roll with it or roll over. I promise you it won't work. But can life actually be good while being someone who suffers from bipolar disorder? I'm here to tell you that it absolutely can and will if you learn how to abide through all of the strikes and gutters the illness throws your way by putting the right supports in place, which is what we'll talk about in the next chapter. This has been a production of Gem City Dudeist Priest, LLC. All rights reserved. To find other formats of this book, visit gemcitydudeistpriest.com/bipolardudeguide. You can find it on bookshelves at Barbara's Bookstore at 111 North State Street in Chicago, or locally at Star City Booksellers in Miamisburg. It's also now being carried by The Words Fair, which you can find at 2nd Street Market every Sunday, right here in Dayton. And if you'd like to donate to the author, you can via Venmo or Cash App at Gem City Dude. Thanks so much for listening, and abide, everyone.